Good afternoon, and welcome to The Road to Recovery, The Road to Freedom with Mark. This is my 28-minute slot every Friday where I talk to you about mental health issues, and I have been doing so for a very long time, in case you think I've just suddenly jumped on this bandwagon. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and something I've been doing for quite a long period of time, and it seems to be that the wave of popularity of the subject has crested and now is somewhat dissipating. You don't hear people banging on and on and on about it on the radios, or no more I am hope and all this nonsense. It seems to just have vanished, and people have moved on to the next fad, which seems at the moment to be picking on farmers, and I really don't understand that. I mean, it saddens me really, because farmers are the best people we've got. They are really, really good, fine, hard-working, tax-paying people who work their backsides off, who try and make this country better, and they are custodians of the land. Now, not every single one of them is perfect, but the vast majority of them are really, really fine, decent people. They do look after that land, and many of them have come to realise that they need to improve their land and minimise their so-called carbon footprint, and that's exactly what they do. Most farmers have planted out the riparian strips, the edges of their creeks and rivers, and fenced them off from cattle to avoid pollution of our waterways. They are environmentally conscious people, and this whole dealio about cattle producing methane is extraordinarily misguided. Unfortunately, the facts of the matter have been completely ignored, and the reality of the situation is so far from where people are right now that I just wonder how on earth people can be so gullible. This seems to be the biggest myth that's out there. Born of ignorance, of course, and the weird thing is, all the information, all the facts of the matter are right there. I've been studying climate change for about 40 years now, and as I say, it's all there. You only have to look up the Smithsonian Institute, and you've got a history of everything that's ever happened. And, it was funny, I was watching the TV the other day, and this chap over in England was saying, this is the hottest summer that's ever been recorded. And in the very next sentence he said, it's the hottest in 80 years. Ever? 80? Seems to be a bit of a difference. The fact of the matter is that in the late 1940s, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, we had an extremely hot summers in those years, and unfortunately we fried, but it got colder. In the 1970s, things like the Franz Josef Glacier were expanding so quickly that they believed at that time, around 75, 76, that it would eventually grow all the way to the sea. Of course, that changed, as things do. The only certainty in this life is change, and that is exactly what happens. And yes, it is at the moment getting a fair bit warmer, but I can absolutely guarantee you at some point it's going to get a damn sight colder, and cows farting has got nothing to do with it. It doesn't. Any organic material eventually decomposes, and when it does, lo and behold, it produces methane. Even rainforests produce millions of tons of methane because things rot. And that's what happens when they rot. Millions upon millions upon millions of wild ruminants elephants, wildebeest, zebra have vanished from this earth. They are gone, and they are no longer producing the methane that they once did. So if you take all of those things into consideration and look at it in a balanced way, there isn't a hell of a lot of difference between what happened 100 years ago, the production, and now. Bigger dangers, far bigger dangers, are things like combustion engines, because methane as a greenhouse gas is far less aggressive and far shorter in its existence than carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide from our filthy cars is way worse than any cows, that's for sure. But we don't think about that. We ignore that situation. And, it's funny. I sat on the side of the motorway up in Auckland. I counted how many people were in each car as they slowly ground along in a traffic jam. 90% of all of the vehicles had one occupant and at least 4 seats. And no one has even mentioned car sharing. Now, if each one of those individuals gave someone else a lift, they would halve the number of cars on the road. 50% less. Just like that. It just amazes me how stupid people really are. And why do I mention this? How is this in any way related to mental health? Well, the fact of the matter is that farmers lead a very stressful life. It's a very uncertain thing, and they are always living on the edge. When you run your own business, there's no guaranteed income, but the bills, they just keep coming. And we have only just started to recognise the mental health problems that a lot of farmers do suffer because they live in relative isolation. There's hardly anyone they can talk to, and they just tough it out as best they can. But what we've got to remember is all of these people are human beings, and they deserve respect, and they certainly do not deserve criticism. And talking about eating meat less each week because of pollution is just deluded. It really is. So I'd like you to take that into consideration, and if you hear somebody putting down farmers and giving them a hard time, just remind them of what damn good people they are and the good job that they do. The other thing I'd like to say is if you do know of anyone who has mental health problems, issues with, be it bipolar or obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, whatever it might be, a kind word goes a long way in those people's lives. What tends to happen, where the pendulum tends to swing, is towards the negative. When you're suffering from mental health, you don't think positive thoughts, and that is the most important thing. A positive mind leads to positive actions. That leads to success, and so the spiral is broken. And you can do a lot towards that, and it doesn't have to be a lot. You don't have to save souls. I'm talking about a few kind words, and that makes all the difference. It can save lives. And you can make a genuine contribution towards your society with very, very little effort. A little bit of kindness and consideration goes an awfully long way. And let's face it, none of us want to see people die. But that is what happens, unfortunately. Not every time, I know. But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is we lose hundreds of people every year to suicide, and I would argue that most of it is avoidable if we just make a little bit more effort. Okay, before I start, I just want to say a big hello to everyone up in the beautiful Hawke's Bay. Welcome aboard. It's great to have you join us. And to all my friends throughout the Wairarapa, and indeed over the hill, out in Pahiatua where I live, I love driving in every day, and this is a particularly good time of year to be driving through, seeing all the lambs being born and the daffodils coming up. It's a time of hope for me, and always reminds me that there's better weather just round the corner, and maybe I might snaff a few fish pretty soon. I want to say a big thanks to all of our sponsors, New Zealand On Air and all the rest of the sponsors, and thank you to Wairarapa TV for coming on board, making all this possible, and a special big thanks to Michael and Veronica, who have supported me all these years. We could always do with sponsorship, so if you know of anyone who's interested, it's very, very cheap to advertise on this radio station, and it does a great job throughout the community. It's a not-for-profit organisation. They are not trying to make money out of you. They are trying to cover costs, and that is all. So it's a really, really worthy cause. It allows people like me to have a voice, and if it wasn't for them, you never would have heard of me. So I'd love you to get in behind and support Arrow Radio. Right, I better be kicking on with today's story. This one's a goodie. This is when I was out in Turkey many years ago. This is called Gallipoli in Istanbul. My good friend Wayne and I had hitchhiked our way around the Aegean coast from Greece to Turkey. We first headed down to the small town of Konakli, which is near the beach we refer to as Gallipoli. We met up with a guy called David, who ran his home as a hostel for travellers, especially Kiwis and Aussies. David was a fantastic host and arranged a cheap taxi trip over the hill to where the great battle for Chunuk had occurred. Wayne and I didn't know what to expect, so we were amazed to find the place left pretty much unchanged from those terrible days when so many young men had perished. There was a small museum temporarily manned by an old geezer, some well-tended graves at the top of the hill, and a large stone plaque from the tomb of President Ataturk. In the most respectful terms, it is written there for all to see. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lay side by side, here in this country of ours. You the mothers, who sent your sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom, and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. Ataturk, 1934. Apart from this plaque, the graves and museum, very little had changed from those terrible days when the abortive landings had taken place. Down on the beach there were thousands of corroded shell casings and bullets lying everywhere. Many of these have been taken as souvenirs by tourists and are quickly disappearing as a result. Up from the beach was an area called the Pines, where many Australian boys had been slaughtered, both by friendly fire and the fierce resistance the Turks had showed. At the time, a simple unsealed road led up to the hills of Chunuk, where the Indians and Kiwis had been decimated. There were open trenches all over the place. Undisturbed from the time those poor boys had fallen, the trenches were full of skull, leg and arm bones protruding from the earth. As the land grew steeper, the number of bones increased and tears flowed freely as I touched them gently. Despite the incredibly steep and exposed terrain, the Kiwis managed to force the Turks off the top, were forced back, and took it a second time, only to be hurled off again. I did not believe in ghosts until that day, but the eerie emptiness of this open graveyard moved me as I had never been. After spending the best part of a day at Gallipoli, we headed back for tea at Konakli, where through David I met up with one of the last Turkish survivors of the campaign. He heaped praise on his old enemies for their fierceness and tenacity, especially the Kiwis. He told me of the extreme hardships they all had to endure, freezing winter and blistering summer in trenches so close they could hear each other talking. It was quite overwhelming to hear of his hardships, and humbling to hear the great respect he held for his old enemy. After a very pleasant and moving stay at Conakry, we headed back up the peninsula and eastward on to Istanbul. This magnificent city on the Golden Horn is split in half by the Bosphorus Strait. On one side lies the new part of the city, with its high rises and western trappings like McDonald's. Fittingly enough, it is on the western bank and emphasises Turkey's wish to join the European Union. The eastern bank, however, is the Byzantium and Constantinople of old. It still retains some of the old Topkapi Palace walls from the Ottomans. Also the magnificent St. Sophia's Byzantium period church. Erected at the height of the Byzantium period, it boasted the largest dome of any church for over 1,000 years. Below St. Sophia's, towards the banks, the dilapidated old buildings lean on each other like drunks. We stayed on the rooftop of one of these dodgy old places, directly below the Blue Mosque, which sits in magnificence further up the hill. I walked up from our dodgy lodgings to St. Sophia's and spent a few hours in its pleasant cool on a blistering hot day. From there I walked up to a quadrant outside the incredible Blue Mosque, with its 6 gigantic minarets. Its overall size is hard to take in. Entering the Blue Mosque, having first washed hands and feet in the cool water and covering from wrist to ankle, is a religious experience in itself. The eye is drawn to the heavens by the untold thousands of beautiful handmade turquoise tiles. The bright light of God, their epicentre. It was impossible to take it all in with one glance. I found myself bowing my head naturally in order to take in the magnificence of this labour of love. The sheer scale only added to the potency of its message. The peace and serenity of this cool sanctuary was most welcome on a hot afternoon. Outside is a quadrant which houses one of the 4 Cleopatra's needles taken from Egypt during the height of empire. The others are located in the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the embankment on the Thames in London, and the Washington Monument in the United States. Strange how the symbols of power are reused by the next great power. These so-called needles are huge columns of stone, tapering from bottom to top and finished at a point. Beautiful and huge in their own right, they are symbols of ancient power, which were enhanced by their new surroundings, especially in Istanbul. At night there was a sound and light show outside the Blue Mosque, which lit it up like a castle from ancient times. This spectacular show transported the crowd back in time to when great sultans ruled over this magnificent city and brought light and civilization into an otherwise dark world. The mighty Ottoman Empire slowly ground to a halt, finally collapsing in the 1920s. After the show, I headed back to our accommodation and got off to sleep with the help of the local hooch called Raki. At first light in the morning, the calling to prayer broke out across the old city via speakers on the minarets of the mosques. Haunting and beautiful, it is an experience that stays with you for a lifetime. In the cool air and beautiful light of the morning, I walked up the hill to the Topkapi Museum. Housed in the ruins of the old castle, It has many priceless works of art and precious gems. Among these is the Topkapi diamond, a huge and beautiful stone which defies belief. Not as large as the Cullen diamond used for the British crown jewels, it nonetheless has an otherworldly clarity to it. It refracts the light so well it almost seems liquid. Also housed there are emeralds the size of dinner plates. Just a tiny fraction of the Sultan's treasures remain. Yet what remains is such a beautiful and impressive collection it only sparks the imagination. There is also a collection of Ming Dynasty pottery so huge that the senses begin to blur on looking at it. Reminiscent of the tales of the Arabian Nights, I could easily imagine a great castle on the hill filled with huge piles of treasure. By the very nature of the development of the city, it is impossible to rebuild what has fallen into disrepair. The ruins, however, only enhance the beauty and mystique of the old city. I left Topkapi Palace in the heat of the afternoon and headed down a street called Divinyol, seeking shade. I came across a smoking cafe where the locals in their traditional loose clothes sat to while away a hot afternoon. The idea of this cafe was that you purchase a huge stub of tobacco for 100 or so lira. You are then waited upon by waiters who carry around hot coals on a plate. These are placed on the stub and put in a huge water pipe. The beautiful hookah pipes, as they are called, have a number of hoses and mouthpieces coming off them so the experience can be shared amongst friends. They also serve hot, sweet tea called simply chai. It comes with no milk. Instead, they serve water with the tea. The cafe itself is an open courtyard protected from the sun by high walls. The tables, chairs and floors are solid granite, and it is refreshingly cool. Old men sit around with friends, chatting and puffing on their pipes. As I watch them, I am transcended in time and imagine the same scene having played itself out for centuries. Even sitting on my own, smoking and watching, was an extremely pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Despite the language barrier, I felt quite accepted. The combination of tea and good tobacco was quite intoxicating. I waited until the burning sun had stooped quite low before wandering down some narrow cobblestone streets. Old men sat on stools at short tables, drinking tea and playing backgammon. Since I had played the game, I asked an old guy if he would like a game. The language barrier can be overcome with hand signals and a few words. Before long I was being thrashed, but I stuck with it until I could hold my own at the breakneck speed. Backgammon is like a national pastime for men, and we played many enjoyable games, some of which I won. We played well into dark that night, and I felt like I had travelled in time, as the time-honoured tradition played itself out. With my first real lesson in backgammon, I headed back down the hill to my rooftop bed. It was only possible to sleep during the small hours because of the heat. Over the next few days, Wayne and I moved to cheaper accommodation, which required a cheap bus ride just out from the old city centre. We visited other great mosques like Suleiman the Magnificent's around the Golden Horn. We also went to local markets with their exotic food and spices. The Turks are natural salesmen and always drive a hard bargain. Centuries of trading on the Silk Route seems to have honed their skills, making trading with them great fun. Despite obvious poverty, the city vibrantly bustles with trade. Handmade carpets are a favourite item with the Turks, and they go to great lengths to sell these works of art. The hot summer days of visiting mosques and markets, of smoking hookah pipes and nights of backgammon passed too quickly. Soon we were off south, down the coast, but the indelible impression of Istanbul stayed with us for the rest of our lives. The end. Oh, managed to sneak that in time, only just. That's me for another week, I'm afraid. Boy, doesn't the time fly when you're having fun. I hope you enjoy my stories, and if you want to catch up with them at your leisure, just look up Arrow Radio on the internet. I think it's www.arrow.co.nz, something like that. And on there are podcasts, recordings of, I think, the last 3 previous shows of all of the sponsored shows. Now, unfortunately, mine's not sponsored. It would be wonderful if someone picked it up and, it's not hellishly expensive. I think it's something in the vicinity of maybe, $150 a month to sponsor. So it's really not a hell of a lot of dough. Unfortunately, because of my mental illness, I'm on the invalid's benefit, so I can't afford to sponsor the show. But if you know anyone who would be interested, it would really, really be great, because it would guarantee that I can continue doing this work and continue writing my stories. And I want to emphasise the fact that just because you do suffer from mental illness, things like depression, it doesn't necessarily make you incapable of doing anything. I'm sure that you can appreciate that it takes a fair bit of ability to write stories like that. And I love them because they remind me of my days as a young man. I spent 7.5 years overseas. I lived in Africa for a couple of years, and I lived in Europe for 5, a bit of time in Southeast Asia, Australia, and I had a wild, wild time, an amazing life. And, I read these stories, I guess, to remind me that good times can and will come again, and I always hold out hope. That's me for another week. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. Tell your friends about it. Share this with others, and I'll catch you again next week. Bye for now.